It was a freezing dawn in 1945. Smoke rose over Berlin's shattered streets, twisting through skeletal buildings that once stood proud against the sky. The air tasted of ash and cordite. Rubble choked the avenues. The city that had promised 1,000 years lay, broken beneath a grey April sky. And beneath the ruins, in the darkness below the fallen stones, a secret waited in silence. Welcome to Untold Dawn, where we uncover the hidden stories history tried to forget. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The thunder of Soviet artillery had become the heartbeat of Berlin, pounding day and night, shaking the foundations of what remained. The Red Army had encircled the city in a crushing embrace of steel and fury. German defenders fought from street to street, building to building, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Reich that once stretched across Europe now measured its territory in city blocks. Time was running out, not in hours or days, but in breaths, in heartbeats, in the seconds between artillery strikes that shook dust from broken ceilings and sent rats scurrying through the underground tunnels beneath the dying capital. Soviet soldiers advanced through the rubble with caution born of bitter experience. Every corner could hide a sniper. Every basement might conceal a desperate last stand. The Germans had turned their own capital into a maze of death traps, fortified positions, and underground passages. Berlin had become a city of ghosts and shadows, where the living moved like specters through the ruins of their former lives. It was in this landscape of destruction that Junior Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov led his reconnaissance unit through the government district on the morning of May 1st, 1945. The area around the Reichstag had been devastated by weeks of bombardment. Buildings that once housed the machinery of Nazi power now stood as hollow shells, their windows like empty eye sockets staring at nothing. The streets were impassable in places, blocked by collapsed facades and twisted metal. Volkov's men picked their way carefully through the debris, rifles ready, eyes scanning for movement. They had been tasked with clearing the administrative buildings near Wilhelmstrasse, searching for documents, intelligence, anything that might prove useful to the advancing Soviet command. But Volkov knew what they were really looking for. Everyone knew. The top Nazi leadership had vanished like smoke. Hitler's whereabouts were unknown. Rumors spread faster than the advancing tanks. Some said he had fled to Bavaria. Others whispered about secret airfields and escape routes to South America. The search for answers had become as important as the battle itself. The building they entered that morning had no name anymore. Whatever plaques or signs it once bore had been torn away by blast waves or buried under rubble. It stood at the edge of what had been a government complex, a 4-story structure of pale stone that leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing. The front entrance had collapsed entirely, so Volkov's unit entered through a shell hole in the western wall, climbing over shattered masonry into what had been a reception hall. Inside, the destruction was total. Furniture lay splintered across floors covered in plaster dust and broken glass. Papers fluttered in the draft that whistled through broken windows. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that echoed through empty rooms. The soldiers spread out, moving from office to office, their boots crunching on debris. They found the usual remnants of hasty evacuation: overturned filing cabinets, abandoned typewriters, a single shoe lying in a hallway, as if someone had simply stepped out of it and kept running. It was Private Anatoly Sokolov who noticed the stairwell. It descended into darkness at the rear of the building, behind what had been a storage room. The entrance was partially blocked by a collapsed ceiling beam, but there was space enough for a man to squeeze through. Sokolov called for Lieutenant Volkov, who came quickly, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The stairs went down. That was unusual. Most basements in this district had been flooded or collapsed during the bombardment. But these steps looked intact, descending into blackness that seemed to swallow the beam of Volkov's flashlight. He paused at the top, listening. No sound came from below, no voices, no movement, just that persistent dripping of water somewhere in the deep. Volkov made his decision quickly. He ordered 3 men to accompany him. Sokolov, naturally, eager as always. Corporal Dmitry Petrov, solid and unflappable. and Sergeant Ivan Kuznetsov, who had been through Stalingrad and could not be frightened by anything Berlin might hold. The rest of the unit would secure the ground floor and watch for German stragglers. If the lieutenant's group did not return within 30 minutes, they were to report to command and request reinforcements. They descended single file, weapons ready, flashlights probing ahead. The stairwell was narrow, the walls close. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp concrete and earth. Volkov counted the steps. 20, 30, 40. They were going deeper than a normal basement, much deeper. The stairs turned twice, switchbacking on themselves before finally opening into a corridor. The corridor was different, clean, almost pristine compared to the destruction above. The walls were painted a neutral gray, unblemished by blast damage or water stains. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, dark now, their glass covers intact. The floor was polished concrete, swept clean of dust. It looked like a place where people had worked recently, yesterday, an hour ago. The contrast with the ruins above was jarring, almost dreamlike. Volkov swept his flashlight beam down the corridor. It stretched perhaps 20 meters before ending in a heavy steel door. To the left and right, other doors punctuated the walls at regular intervals. 5 on each side. 10 rooms then, or offices, or cells. It was impossible to tell from the corridor alone. The soldiers moved forward cautiously, their boots echoing in the confined space. The sound seemed too loud, intrusive, as if they were violating a silence that had settled here like snow. The first door on the right stood slightly ajar. Volkov approached it carefully, pushing it open with the barrel of his rifle. The hinges moved smoothly without a sound. The room beyond was small, perhaps 3 meters square, furnished with a metal desk, a wooden chair, and a filing cabinet against the far wall. Papers covered the desk in neat stacks. A fountain pen lay beside an open logbook, as if whoever had been writing had simply stood up and walked away mid-sentence. Sokolov entered the room and picked up the logbook, angling it toward his flashlight. The entries were in German, written in a precise, methodical hand. Dates, times, names. The last entry was dated April 30th, 1945. Yesterday, the ink looked fresh. Sokolov showed it to Volkov, who studied it silently for a moment before ordering it collected as evidence. They moved to the next room. This one was larger, set up as a communication station. Radio equipment lined one wall, tubes dark and cold. Headphones hung from hooks. A large map of Berlin covered another wall, marked with colored pins and pencil lines showing troop movements and defensive positions. Some of the markings were recent, Volkov noted. The German forces marked on the map matched intelligence reports from 3 days ago. Whoever had been using this room had been tracking the battle in real time, right up until they abandoned it. But why abandon it? That was the question that gnawed at Volkov as they continued their exploration. This bunker, if that was what it was, showed no signs of bombardment. No damage, no breaches. The air was stale but breathable. The structure seemed sound. So why had the occupants left? And more importantly, where had they gone? The third room held bunks, 6 of them, arranged in 2 tiers along the walls. Military blankets lay folded at the foot of each bed. Personal effects occupied small shelves beside each bunk, photographs in frames, books, a harmonica, a pocket watch, the detritus of lives lived in confined spaces. Kuznetsov examined one of the photographs. A young man in a Wehrmacht uniform stood beside a woman and 2 children, all smiling at the camera. The sergeant slipped the photograph into his pocket without comment. Room 4 was a kitchen, small but functional, with a 2-burner electric stove, a sink, shelves stocked with canned goods and dried rations. A pot sat on one of the burners. Volkov approached it carefully and touched the side. Cold, but when he lifted the lid, the smell of soup rose up. Potato and cabbage, the staple of wartime Germany. He dipped a finger into the liquid and tasted it. Still edible. Made within the last day or 2, certainly. Perhaps even yesterday. That discovery changed everything. Someone had been here recently, very recently, cooking, eating, living. And then they had left in such haste that they abandoned a pot of soup still sitting on the stove. Volkov felt the first stirrings of unease. Something was wrong here. Something that did not fit the pattern of military withdrawal or evacuation. People fleeing a bunker might leave documents or equipment behind, but they took food. Always, food was too precious, especially now. The fifth room was locked. Volkov rattled the handle, then stepped back and nodded to Petrov, who was the strongest among them. The corporal braced himself and kicked the door beside the lock. Once, twice. On the third kick, the frame splintered and the door swung open. The room beyond was an office, larger than the first one they had found, better furnished. A heavy wooden desk dominated the center, its surface covered with papers, maps, and what looked like personnel files. A leather chair sat behind the desk. On the wall, a large portrait of Adolf Hitler stared down at them with that familiar, intense gaze. But someone had slashed the portrait with a knife, cutting deep gashes across the face, as if in a fit of rage or desperation. Sokolov moved to the desk and began sorting through the papers. Most were administrative, duty rosters, supply requisitions, routine military bureaucracy. But beneath these mundane documents, he found something more interesting. A leather folder, sealed with wax. He broke the seal and opened it. Inside were orders, typed on official letterhead, dated April 28th. The orders directed the evacuation of an unnamed facility, referring only to site designator FK-17. All personnel were to be relocated to secondary positions by April 30th at the latest. All classified materials were to be destroyed. The facility was to be sealed and abandoned, but the bunker had not been destroyed. The classified materials, if that was what all these papers were, had not been burned, and the facility had not been properly sealed. The steel door at the end of the corridor stood closed but not locked. Someone had disobeyed orders, or perhaps they had run out of time. Volkov took the folder and continued down the corridor. The remaining rooms on this side held more bunks, a small medical station with basic supplies, and a storage closet filled with uniforms and equipment. Everything organized, everything in its place. It was like walking through a museum exhibit of life underground during the final days of the Reich. They reached the steel door at the corridor's end. It was massive, perhaps 8 centimeters thick, with heavy bolts and a wheel lock mechanism like something from a ship. Volkov tried the wheel. It turned easily, well-oiled and maintained. The bolts drew back with solid mechanical clicks. He pulled the door open. Beyond lay another corridor, wider than the first, stretching deeper into the earth. This one showed more signs of military purpose. The walls were reinforced with steel plates. Cable conduits ran along the ceiling. Ventilation grills hummed with the faint movement of air, suggesting that some sort of backup power system still functioned somewhere in the complex. The corridor branched in 3 directions: left, right, and straight ahead, descending via another stairwell into deeper levels. Volkov checked his watch. They had been underground for 18 minutes. 12 minutes remained before the surface team would sound the alarm. He made a quick decision. Petrov and Kuznetsov would explore the left branch. Sokolov would come with him down the right. They would regroup at this junction in 8 minutes, then return to the surface. If anyone failed to return on time, the others would withdraw immediately and report. The soldiers split up. Volkov and Sokolov moved right, their flashlights cutting twin beams through the darkness. This corridor was shorter, ending after perhaps 15 meters in a set of double doors. Stenciled on the doors in faded paint were the words "Nur für Autorisch's personal," authorized personnel only. The doors were unlocked. Inside, they found what could only be described as a war room. A large table occupied the center, its surface covered with maps and tactical documents. Chairs surrounded the table, pushed back as if the occupants had stood up suddenly and never returned. On the walls, more maps. Berlin, Germany, Europe. Each one marked with the shrinking boundaries of German control, updated day by day until the maps showed nothing but a small pocket around the capital itself. But it was the far wall that drew Volkov's attention. A large clock hung there, its hands frozen at 3 hours and 7 minutes. Below the clock, A chalkboard displayed a list of names and positions, presumably the command staff who had used this room. Many names had been crossed out. Beside some, the word Jeffolin, fallen, beside others, vermist, missing. Sokolov walked slowly around the table, his flashlight playing across the documents scattered there. Meeting notes, battle assessments, casualty reports, the final record of men trying to manage a war they had already lost. And there, in the center of the table, a calendar. The page showed April 30th, 1945. Someone had circled the date in red ink and written a single word beside it. End. End. They left the war room and returned to the junction. Petrov and Kuznetsov were already waiting, their faces pale in the dim light. They had found similar rooms in their branch. More offices, more evidence of recent occupation and sudden abandonment. But they had also found something else. A diary left open on a desk. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, spoke of evacuation orders and confusion. The writer described hearing explosions above, feeling the building shake, receiving contradictory orders to stay and to flee. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page. Time was running short. 27 minutes since they had descended. They needed to return to the surface. But Volkov found himself drawn to the third corridor, the one with the stairwell leading down. What lay in the deeper levels? What else had been abandoned here in the final hours before the Reich collapsed? Against his better judgment, he made the decision to look. Just a quick reconnaissance. 5 minutes, no more. He left Petrov and Kuznetsov at the junction with orders to return to the surface if he and Sokolov did not reappear in exactly 5 minutes. Then he descended the stairs. This level was different, colder. The air had a quality to it, a stillness that felt almost physical. The corridor at the bottom of the stairs was narrower, more oppressive. Water had leaked in somewhere, creating puddles on the floor that reflected their flashlight beams in shimmering patterns. Volkov counted 4 doors on this level, all closed, all unmarked. He opened the first door, a generator room. Large diesel engines sat silent and cold, their fuel tanks empty. Electrical panels lined the walls, switches thrown to the off position. This had been the power source for the bunker, Volkov realized. When the fuel ran out, the lights went dark. Perhaps that was when the occupants finally abandoned the facility, when they could no longer see. The second door revealed a storage room filled with supplies. Canned food, water containers, medical supplies, enough to sustain perhaps 30 people for several months. But the stores had not been looted or removed. They sat on their shelves, orderly and untouched, as if waiting for occupants who would never return. The third door was locked more securely than any they had encountered so far. Multiple deadbolts, a chain, a padlock. Volkov studied it for a moment, then decided they had no time to force entry. Whatever lay behind that door would have to wait for another day for other soldiers with proper equipment. But the fourth door stood open, not just unlocked, but standing wide, as if someone had run through it without stopping to close it behind them. Volkov approached cautiously, every instinct warning him that something here was not right. The room beyond was dark, darker than the others, and his flashlight seemed to barely penetrate the gloom. It was a records room. Filing cabinets lined every wall, floor to ceiling. Thousands of files, tens of thousands. The paper trail of an organization preserved in the darkness beneath a dying city. But the cabinets had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, files scattered across the floor in drifts of paper. Someone had been searching for something specific, throwing aside everything else in their haste. Sokolov bent to pick up one of the scattered files. Personnel records by the look of them. Names, photographs, service histories. He opened one at random and found himself looking at the face of a young man, barely out of his teens, who had died at Kursk in 1943. He dropped the file and picked up another. A woman this time, a secretary or clerk, whose file simply ended in April 1945 with no explanation. There were so many files, so many lives reduced to paper and photographs, now scattered across a flooded concrete floor. Volkov checked his watch. Time was up. They had to leave. He called to Sokolov, who reluctantly left the records room, and together they climbed back to the junction level. Petrov and Kuznetsov were still there, tense and worried. The four soldiers moved quickly back through the corridors, past the war room and the kitchen and the sleeping quarters, up the long stairwell to the building above. The fresh air, even laden with smoke and dust as it was, tasted like salvation after the stale atmosphere of the bunker. The rest of the unit was waiting anxiously. Volkov ordered 2 men to stand guard at the stairwell entrance while he reported the discovery to command. Within an hour, more troops arrived. Officers, intelligence personnel, engineers who could assess the bunker's structure and contents. Over the following days, the bunker was thoroughly documented and emptied. The files and documents were collected and sent to Moscow for analysis. The equipment was catalogued. The supplies were distributed to Soviet units. And slowly, as linguists translated the German documents, a picture emerged of what the bunker had been. Facility FK-17 had been a regional command post, established in 1943 as part of Berlin's underground defense network. It had housed a rotating staff of military officers, communications specialists, and administrative personnel. Its purpose had been to coordinate civil defense efforts and maintain communication with outlying units as the Allied forces closed in on the capital. Nothing extraordinary, nothing particularly secret. Just another cog in the vast machinery of the Third Reich, grinding on even as the machine itself fell apart. But that did not explain the mysteries. It did not explain why the evacuation had been so hasty and incomplete, why the soup had been left on the stove, why the diary entry ended mid-sentence, why files had been scattered across the records room floor as if someone had been desperately searching for something in the final minutes before abandoning the bunker. And it certainly did not explain the clocks. As investigators explored the bunker more thoroughly, they found that every clock in the facility had stopped at precisely the same time. 3 hours and 7 minutes. Not just the clock in the war room, but all of them. The small alarm clock beside one of the bunks, the watch left on a desk, even the wall clock in the kitchen, all frozen at 3:07. The coincidence seemed impossible. Clocks do not synchronize their failures. They do not all stop at the same moment unless something causes them to stop. An electromagnetic pulse, a power failure. But the bunker's clocks were mechanical, wind-up devices that did not depend on electricity. They should have kept running long after the occupants fled and the generators ran dry. One of the Soviet engineers offered a theory. Perhaps someone had deliberately stopped all the clocks before evacuating, marking the moment of abandonment. But why? What purpose would that serve? And if someone had taken the time to stop every clock in the facility, why had they left behind food and documents and supplies? Why had they run as if fleeing from something? No one had answers. The German personnel who had staffed the bunker had vanished into the chaos of Berlin's final days. Some had likely died in the fighting. Others had been captured and sent to prisoner of war camps, their individual stories lost among hundreds of thousands. A few might have escaped westward, melting into the refugee streams that clogged every road leading away from the capital. There was no way to find them, no way to ask what had happened in the depths of FK-17 on the night of April 30th, at precisely 3 hours and 7 minutes past midnight. Lieutenant Volkov wrote his report, detailing everything they had found. He described the pristine corridors and the abandoned rooms, the soup on the stove and the photograph of the smiling family, the slashed portrait of Hitler and the frozen clocks. His report was filed with thousands of others, documenting the fall of Berlin and the discoveries made in its aftermath. It was read, noted, and archived, and there it remained, gathering dust in military files, while the world moved on and the ruins of Berlin were cleared away and rebuilt into something new. But Volkov never forgot that morning. Even decades later, when he was an old man living in a small apartment in Leningrad, he would sometimes wake in the night thinking about the bunker. He would remember the silence of those corridors, the smell of the abandoned soup, the faces in the photographs. And he would wonder what had happened down there in the darkness, what had sent trained soldiers fleeing from their posts, leaving behind everything including their reasons for running. The bunker beneath Berlin was not unique. That was what the investigators discovered as they compared notes and cross-referenced intelligence reports in the weeks following Germany's surrender. The Third Reich had been a state obsessed with secrecy and survival, and nowhere was this more evident than in the vast network of underground facilities that honeycombed the earth beneath its cities. Berlin alone contained hundreds of bunkers, ranging from small civilian shelters to massive military command centers. Some were documented, many were not. The city's subterranean geography had become a maze of concrete and steel, built layer upon layer over decades of paranoia and preparation. The most famous, of course, was the Führer bunker, where Adolf Hitler spent his final days. Located beneath the Reich Chancellery, it had been the nerve center of a collapsing empire, a place where desperate orders were issued to armies that no longer existed. But the Führer bunker was just the largest node in a network that extended throughout the government district. Tunnels connected it to other facilities. Emergency exits led to different buildings. The entire area beneath Wilhelmstrasse and Warstrasse had been transformed into an underground city, complete with power generation, water supplies, and communication systems. Facility FK-17 was part of this network, though it occupied a lower tier of importance. It had not housed the highest leadership. It had not controlled armies or directed strategic operations. It had been, in the hierarchy of Nazi bureaucracy, a middle management facility. Important enough to be well equipped and properly staffed, but not important enough to warrant the attention that other bunkers received as the end approached. And perhaps that was why it remained so intact. The truly important facilities had been fought over, destroyed, or stripped clean by their own occupants before capture. FK-17 had simply been forgotten in the chaos. But forgotten by whom? And why had its occupants fled so suddenly? As Soviet intelligence officers pieced together information from captured documents and interrogated prisoners, a picture began to emerge of the bunker's final days. The facility had maintained regular operations throughout April, even as the Red Army encircled Berlin. Communications logs showed routine check-ins with other command posts, reports filed on schedule, no indication of unusual activity. The staff consisted of 23 individuals, 17 military personnel ranging in rank from captain to private, 6 civilians, mostly clerical workers and technical specialists. Their names were on the roster. Their photographs were in their personnel files. They had been real people, going about their duties as the world collapsed around them. The last confirmed communication from FK-17 had been logged at 2100 hours on April 29th. A routine status report transmitted to a regional defense headquarters that itself would fall to Soviet forces within 24 hours. Nothing in the message suggested any problems. The bunker was secure. Power and supplies were adequate. Morale was, according to the stilted language of military reporting, acceptable given the circumstances. The officer who signed the report was Hauptmann Wilhelm Dietrich, the facility's commanding officer. His signature appeared on dozens of documents found in the bunker. Always neat, always precise. The signature of a man who maintained standards even as everything else fell apart. But after that final transmission, there was nothing. No further communications, no additional reports. The bunker went silent, and when Soviet soldiers entered it 3 days later, they found it abandoned. What had happened in those 72 hours? One theory emerged from an unexpected source. A Soviet soldier, not part of Volkov's original team, who had been exploring the ruins above the bunker in the days following its discovery. He had found, partially buried in rubble near what had been the building's front entrance, a charred journal. The fire damage was extensive, but enough pages remained legible to provide a fragmentary account. The journal belonged to someone named Anna, no last name given, who identified herself as a clerical worker assigned to an underground facility. She did not name the facility specifically, but the details she described matched FK-17 precisely. Anna's journal entries were personal rather than official. She wrote about the claustrophobia of underground life, the recycled air that always tasted stale, the artificial light that never changed, making it impossible to tell day from night without checking the clocks. She wrote about the other people in the bunker, describing small dramas and tensions that arose when human beings were confined together in a concrete box beneath a city being torn apart by artillery. She wrote about fear, not the sharp terror of immediate danger, but the grinding, exhausting fear of knowing that the world above was ending and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Her final entries, dated late April, showed increasing distress. The power had become unreliable, she wrote. The generators kept cutting out, plunging the bunker into darkness for minutes at a time before sputtering back to life. Strange noises echoed through the ventilation system, banging, scraping. Once she thought she heard voices in the tunnels beyond their section, but when the guards investigated, they found nothing. The other workers were becoming paranoid, she noted. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the corridors at night when everyone was supposed to be asleep. Others insisted they saw shadows moving in the unlit sections of the bunker, shapes that vanished when flashlights were turned toward them. Hauptmann Dietrich dismissed these concerns as stress and exhaustion, Anna wrote. He insisted that everyone maintain their routines and their discipline. The war would be over soon, one way or another, and they would survive it by staying calm and following procedures. But even Dietrich seemed unsettled, according to Anna. He had begun sleeping in his office rather than in the bunks with the other officers. He kept his pistol on his desk, within easy reach, and he had ordered all doors to be kept locked at night, with guards posted at key junctions in the corridor system. The journal's final entry was dated April 30th. Anna wrote that the situation had deteriorated badly. The generators had failed completely that afternoon, and the emergency batteries were running low. They had perhaps 6 hours of dim lighting left, and then nothing but darkness. Dietrich had called a meeting of all personnel. He told them that evacuation orders had been received. They were to abandon the facility at 0300 hours on May 1st, moving in small groups to the surface and dispersing into the city. Each person was responsible for destroying any classified materials in their possession. The bunker itself would be sealed, but not destroyed. There was no time for demolition, and no explosives available even if there had been time. But Anna's entry did not end there. She added a final paragraph, written in a different hand than the rest of the journal. The writing was shaky, the letters barely controlled. She wrote that something was wrong. That Dietrich had been acting strangely after the meeting, checking and rechecking the locks on the deeper levels, particularly the chain door on the lowest floor. That she had heard the sound again, the one that had been haunting the ventilation system, and this time it was closer, much closer. It sounded like breathing, she wrote, heavy and labored, as if something large was moving through the tunnels beyond their section. The guards heard it too. Everyone heard it. And Dietrich had gone pale, actually pale, before ordering everyone to gather their belongings and prepare to evacuate immediately. Not at 0300 as planned, but now, right now. The entry ended there. The rest of the journal pages were too badly burned to read. Soviet investigators were skeptical of Anna's account. The stress of living underground during a siege could produce hallucinations, paranoia, mass hysteria. The sound she described could have been anything. Pipes settling as the building above collapsed. Rubble shifting in the tunnels. Even rats, which had become abundant in Berlin's underground spaces, feeding on whatever they could find. To read anything supernatural or mysterious into, it was to let imagination overrule reason. But then, why had the evacuation happened early? The official orders Anna mentioned called for departure at 0300 hours on May 1st. Yet the evidence in the bunker suggested that people had left much earlier, probably on the evening of April 30th. The soup on the stove, the open diary ending mid-sentence, the scattered files in the records room, all pointed to a hasty departure that did not match the scheduled evacuation timeline. And there was another detail that troubled investigators. The chain door on the lowest level, the one Anna mentioned in her final journal entry. the door that Volkov and his team had not forced open during their initial exploration. When engineers finally cut through the chains and locks, they found something that none of the other rooms had contained. The door opened onto a short corridor, perhaps 3 meters long, ending in a blank concrete wall. Nothing else. No equipment, no storage, just an empty corridor leading nowhere. But the concrete wall at the end showed tool marks, as if someone had hastily bricked up an opening. And when engineers brought acoustic sensors to examine the wall's thickness, they detected a void beyond it. A space. Perhaps another corridor or a room. Something that had been sealed off, deliberately walled away from the rest of the facility. The engineers wanted to break through to see what lay beyond. But by that point, other priorities had taken precedence. Berlin was being occupied and divided among the Allied powers. The focus shifted from investigation to administration, from uncovering secrets to managing the practical realities of a devastated city. The bunker was officially sealed, its location noted in Soviet military records, and the engineers moved on to other tasks. The void behind the wall remained unexplored. Over the following years, as Berlin healed and rebuilt, the bunker beneath Wilhelmstrasse was largely forgotten. The building above it was demolished, the rubble cleared away, new construction began. The entrance that Volkov's unit had used was buried under tons of concrete and steel. The bunker became inaccessible, entombed beneath the new Berlin that rose from the ashes of the old. Occasionally, someone would remember it existed. A historian researching the city's wartime infrastructure, an engineer consulting old maps during a construction project, but no one made any serious effort to reopen it or investigate further. There seemed little point. It was just another relic of a war everyone wanted to forget. But the mystery endured. Hauptmann Wilhelm Dietrich was never accounted for in post-war records. He did not appear on any prisoner of war lists. His name was not among the dead identified in Berlin's final battles. He simply vanished, along with the other 22 personnel assigned to FK-17. Some might have died in the chaos of Berlin's fall. Some might have escaped to the west. But it seemed statistically unlikely that all 23 would disappear without a trace, that not one would survive to be captured or identified. There were other bunkers where personnel vanished. Other facilities abandoned in circumstances that were never fully explained. The collapse of the Third Reich was chaotic enough that many mysteries were simply accepted as unsolvable. Records were destroyed. Witnesses died or disappeared. The fog of war obscured everything. And yet, FK-17 stood out. Not for the scale of its mystery, but for its specificity. The stopped clocks, the hasty evacuation, the sealed void behind the wall, Anna's journal with its account of sounds in the darkness. Taken individually, each detail had a rational explanation. But taken together, they formed a pattern that resisted easy interpretation. Mikhail Volkov was interviewed about the bunker several times over the years. Historians and journalists occasionally tracked him down, asking about that morning in May 1945, when he and his men descended the stairs into the unknown. He always told the story the same way, never embellishing, never claiming to know more than he did. But when pressed about his feelings, about what he thought had really happened down there, he would pause and consider his words carefully. The bunker felt wrong, he would say. Not obviously wrong, not in any way he could point to and explain, but wrong nonetheless. He had cleared hundreds of buildings during the war, had entered cellars and bunkers and underground shelters across half of Europe. He knew what an abandoned place felt like. The emptiness, the silence, the sense of absence where presence had been, but FK-17 did not feel abandoned. It felt evacuated. There was a difference, though he struggled to articulate what that difference was. It was as if the people had not left by choice, but had been driven out. Not by the advancing Soviet forces, which had still been blocks away when the evacuation occurred. Not by bombardment, which had not touched the bunker's structure, but by something else. Something that had made trained soldiers and experienced officers drop what they were doing and flee into the night. When asked if he thought something had been down there with them during that first exploration, something they had not seen or understood, Volkov would shrug. He did not believe in ghosts or supernatural forces. He had seen too much of war's reality to indulge in fantasy. But he also knew that there were things in the world that defied simple explanation. Coincidences that seemed too precise to be random. Patterns that emerged from chaos. Mysteries that remained mysterious not because the answers did not exist, but because the answers had been lost or hidden or deliberately obscured. And he remembered the clocks. That detail stayed with him more than any other. All stopped at 3:07. Mechanical clocks that should have kept running, frozen at the same moment. He had checked his own watch when they found the first stopped clock, and he had checked it again hours later when the investigation was underway. His watch had been working perfectly. So had the watches of his men. The bunker had not experienced any electromagnetic phenomenon. There had been no power surge, no blast wave, nothing that would cause every timepiece to stop simultaneously. Unless someone had gone around and manually stopped each one. Unless, in the midst of a panicked evacuation, someone had taken the time to mark the moment of their departure in the most deliberate way possible. But why? Why would anyone do that? What message were they trying to send? Or what event were they trying to memorialize? Volkov died in 1983, taking his questions with him. By then, the Cold War had divided Berlin into two cities, split by a wall that made the wartime destruction seem almost gentle by comparison. The site where FK-17 lay buried was in the eastern sector, under Soviet control, but no one attempted to excavate it. The Cold War had its own mysteries and obsessions. The ghosts of 1945 seemed quaint and irrelevant compared to the nuclear standoff that defined the present. It was only after the wall fell and Germany reunified that interest in the wartime bunkers experienced a revival. Historians gained access to archives that had been closed for decades. Engineers began surveying the underground infrastructure, planning for modernization and preservation. And somewhere in that process, someone rediscovered the records of FK-17, the reports filed by Volkov and his men, the documents recovered from the bunker, Anna's partial journal, the photographs of the stopped clocks and the abandoned rooms. A small team of researchers petitioned for access to the site. They wanted to excavate the bunker, to document what remained, to finally break through the sealed wall and see what lay in the void beyond. Permissions were granted slowly as bureaucracy ground through its processes. Funding had to be secured. Safety assessments had to be completed. It took years of planning before actual work could begin. But when excavation finally started in 2007, 62 years after the bunker was sealed, the team encountered immediate problems. The area had been built over multiple times. Foundations from successive construction projects had been sunk deep into the earth, some intersecting with the bunker's structure. Water damage had been extensive. Decades of neglect had taken their toll. The corridors that Volkov had walked through in 1945 were now partially collapsed, flooded, unstable. Progress was slow and dangerous. The team managed to reach the upper level after weeks of careful excavation. They found much of what the original Soviet reports had described. The offices, the war room with its frozen clock still hanging on the wall, its hands still marking 3:07. The bunks where soldiers had slept. The kitchen with its stove, the part long since removed, but the stains of old soup still visible on the burner. Everything was in worse condition than the 1945 photographs showed, corroded by time and moisture, but recognizable. They pushed deeper, following Volkov's route down to the lower level. The generator room was flooded completely, the diesel engines now just rusted hulks beneath dark water. The storage room's shelves had collapsed, but they found the records room, that space where files had been scattered across the floor in Anna's account. The papers were long since pulp, degraded beyond recovery. But the filing cabinets remained, toppled and rusted, but still present, still testament to the frantic search that had occurred here in the final hours. And then they reached the chain door. The chains themselves had corroded away to almost nothing, but the door remained, warped by moisture but intact. Beyond it, the short corridor leading to the bricked-up wall. The team brought in ground-penetrating radar, more sophisticated than the acoustic sensors used in 1945. The void beyond the wall was confirmed. It was not a large space, perhaps 4 meters by 4 meters. A room, then, or a cell, something that had been sealed away before the bunker was abandoned. Breaking through the wall was delicate work. The entire structure was unstable, liable to collapse if stressed improperly. It took 2 days of careful drilling and removal before they had opened a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. The team leader, a historian named Dr. Stefan Richter, volunteered to be the first to enter. He wore a respirator against any toxic gases that might have built up over 60-plus years of sealed confinement. He carried a powerful flashlight, and he carried a camera to document whatever he found. What he found was emptiness. The room beyond the wall contained nothing. No equipment, no documents, no furniture, just bare concrete walls, floor and ceiling. No marks, no graffiti, no indication that anything had ever been stored there. It was, in every sense, a void. A space that had been deliberately created and then sealed away, serving no apparent purpose, except for one detail. One small, inexplicable detail that Dr. Richter almost missed in his initial sweep. In the far corner of the room, scratched into the concrete floor with some sharp implement, were words. German words, carved deep enough to remain legible despite decades of accumulated dust. Dr. Richter knelt and brushed the dust away, angling his flashlight to read the inscription. Ich kam aus der Tiefe. It came from the depths. Below that, another line. Wir konnten es nicht aufhalten. We could not stop it. And below that, a date, 30 April 1945, and a time, 0307. Dr. Richter photographed the inscription carefully from multiple angles. He took samples of the concrete to confirm the age of the carvings. He documented the room's dimensions and its position relative to the rest of the bunker structure. And then he withdrew, sealing the gap behind him, because the structural instability made it too dangerous to remain longer. The photographs were analyzed. The inscriptions were authenticated as period-appropriate, carved by someone with access to the room before it was sealed. But beyond confirming that the words were genuinely from 1945, the analysis revealed nothing new. The identity of who carved them remained unknown. The meaning of the phrases remained ambiguous. It came from the depths. What came? Stop what? Some researchers theorized that the inscription referred to the advancing Soviet forces, that whoever sealed this room had been commenting on the military situation, using dramatic language to describe the enemy closing in from all directions. The depths could mean the subway tunnels, which Soviet troops used to move through the city unseen, or it could refer to the collective psychological state of the German defenders, feeling surrounded and overwhelmed. Others suggested that the inscription was evidence of mental breakdown, that whoever wrote it had been suffering from the stress of the siege, perhaps experiencing hallucinations or paranoid delusions. The bunker's confined atmosphere, the constant tension, the knowledge of impending defeat could push someone to the edge of sanity. The inscription would then be not a factual account, but a psychological artifact, the desperate words of someone losing touch with reality. But these explanations felt incomplete. They did not account for why the room had been sealed so thoroughly. They did not explain why it had been walled up before the evacuation, requiring time and effort that should have been spent on more urgent tasks. And they certainly did not address why the inscription's timestamp matched exactly the moment when every clock in the bunker had stopped. 3 hours and 7 minutes. The same time. The time when, according to Anna's journal, the evacuation had been moved up suddenly. The time when, according to the inscription, something had happened. Something significant enough that someone felt compelled to leave a permanent record carved into concrete before sealing the room away forever. The excavation team completed their work in 2008. They produced a comprehensive report documenting everything they had found. The report included architectural surveys, historical analysis, and detailed photographs of every room and corridor. It concluded that FK-17 had been a standard wartime bunker, abandoned during Berlin's final days. notable only for the good state of preservation in which it had been initially discovered, and the mysterious circumstances of its evacuation. The sealed room and its inscription were acknowledged as anomalies that defied complete explanation, but the report's authors cautioned against reading too much into them. History was full of mysteries that arose from lost context, incomplete records, and the simple chaos of human events. The report was published. It was read by a small circle of specialists and interested amateurs. And then, like so much historical research, it was filed away and largely forgotten. Life moved on. Berlin continued its transformation into a modern capital. The site above the bunker was developed into office space. People worked and lived and went about their daily lives, unaware of the concrete tomb beneath their feet, unaware of the questions it still held. But for those who had explored the bunker, who had touched its walls and breathed its air and stood in its silent rooms, the mystery remained alive. Dr. Richter never quite let it go. He continued researching, following threads that led nowhere, interviewing elderly survivors who might remember something useful. He found a few additional fragments. A letter from a soldier who claimed to have heard explosions beneath Berlin in late April, coming from deep underground where no explosions should have been possible. A memo from Soviet military intelligence expressing concern about uncharted tunnel systems in the government district, some of which seemed to extend much deeper than any known construction. A newspaper article from 1946, quickly retracted, that mentioned workers during reconstruction discovering shafts that descended into bedrock for hundreds of meters, their purpose unknown. None of it was conclusive. All of it was suggestive. And taken together, it hinted at something that neither wartime records nor post-war investigation had fully uncovered. That beneath Berlin's known bunker network, there had been something else, something deeper, something that perhaps had been connected to FK-17 through the void behind the sealed wall. Something that might have made sounds in the darkness. Something that might have driven 23 people to flee their posts in the middle of the night, stopping the clocks on their way out, as if marking the moment when they decided that survival meant abandoning their duties and running. But what? What could have been down there? The question had no answer. Or rather, it had too many answers, none of them verifiable. Secret weapons projects, forgotten mine shafts, natural caverns connected to the city's groundwater system, delusions and hysteria amplified by the stress of siege. The mundane mixed with the mysterious until it became impossible to separate fact from speculation. And so the bunker remained what it had always been, a place where time stopped, where ordinary people doing ordinary jobs suddenly encountered something that made them abandon everything and flee, where the careful records and routines of military life gave way to chaos and silence, where questions multiplied while answers evaporated like morning mist. Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov had been right. The bunker felt evacuated, not abandoned. The difference mattered. Abandoned places were empty because their purpose had ended. Evacuated places were empty because something had forced the occupants out. And FK-17, with its pristine corridors and its frozen clocks, with its sealed room and its cryptic warning carved in concrete, was definitely the latter. The people who lived and worked there had not casually walked away when the war ended. They had run. They had fled. They had left behind everything that could not be carried quickly, including their explanations for why they were running. History is full of such mysteries, places where the chain of cause and effect breaks down, where the normal explanations do not quite fit, where something happened that nobody wanted to record accurately or that nobody survived to record at all. The bunker beneath Berlin was one of these places, not the most dramatic, not the most important, just a small mystery in a war full of them, a footnote in the larger catastrophe of the Third Reich's collapse. But small mysteries have their own power. They remind us that even the most documented, most studied events in history still contain gaps, still harbor secrets, still hold spaces where the truth slipped away and was never recovered. The bunker is a metaphor, perhaps, for all of history's blind spots, the places we cannot see, the moments we cannot reconstruct, the stories that vanished along with the people who lived them. When the smoke cleared over Berlin in May 1945, the world thought it knew what had happened. The narrative was clear: evil defeated, justice served, lessons learned. But beneath the ruins, in the darkness under the shattered city, there were stories that did not fit the narrative. Stories that suggested the reality had been stranger, more complex, more unsettling than the official accounts allowed. Facility FK-17 was one of those stories. A place where 23 people worked and lived until one night they did not. Where clocks stopped at 3:07 for reasons nobody could explain. Where someone carved a warning into concrete before sealing a room that contained nothing but emptiness. Where the depths, whatever that meant, had delivered something that could not be stopped. The bunker is sealed now, buried under modern Berlin. Inaccessible except through old reports and fading photographs. The people who explored it are growing old or have already passed away. The generation that fought the war is gone entirely. Soon, there will be no living memory of those final desperate days, only the historical record with all its gaps and uncertainties. And the mystery will remain, not because it is important, not because it changes anything about how we understand the war or its outcome, but because it is there, because it happened. Because somewhere beneath a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt and transformed beyond recognition, there is a bunker where time stopped, where something happened that sent people fleeing into the night, where the clocks all froze at the same moment, marking an event that nobody documented and nobody explained. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was silence, and the lesson history never forgot. That even in our most certain moments, even in our clearest narratives, there are shadows, there are gaps, there are bunkers beneath the surface, holding secrets that will never be fully revealed. And sometimes, the most honest thing we can say is that we do not know. We were not there. We did not see. And the people who did see chose not to speak, or could not speak, or ran away before anyone could ask them why. The bunker where time stopped remains beneath Berlin, silent, dark, forgotten by most, but there for anyone who cares to remember that history is not just what we know. It is also what we do not know, what we cannot know, what was lost when the clocks froze at 3 hours and 7 minutes, and 23 people fled into the smoke and ruins of a dying city, leaving behind only questions and the persistent, unsettling feeling that something had come from the depths, and they could not stop it.